Tiny bunny. Tiny bunny. I have no idea where I came up with that. And Hi, I'm Ian. Around here I talk about books because I love to yap. And these are the books that I hated or DNF'd in 2024. So I read 70 books in 2024, which was a personal record that I literally will never accomplish again because so help me God, I will be socializing with friends instead. My average rating in 2024 was 3.68 stars. My worst year of reading ever was 2023 with an average rating of 3.11 stars, which was so indicative of the literal existential crisis I was going through as a reader at the time. I had a personal life too, I didn't think about that. For contrast, my best year was 2021 with an average rating of 3.81 stars. I had like 10 5-star books. This year I read 11 books that were rated less than 3 stars by yours truly. I've gotten so good at DNFing books, especially this year, that I pretty much have saved myself from reading truly terrible stuff. But getting so good at DNFing books meant that I did not enter a prolonged reading slump at all this year. Without further ado, here are the 10 worst books that I read in 2024. Headshot by Rita Bullwinkle. This is short, 207 pages. I found out about it because it was longlisted for the Booker Prize. And this is really just a great example of a story that just does not resonate with me. So Headshot takes place in Reno, Nevada during a young women's boxing tournament. And each chapter in here is a different match between two different women. And in those chapters, we get inside the heads of each of the players, kind of going back and forth, a bit of a narrative spar, if you will. What I think is crucial to me not really connecting with this is the fact that the author is more interested in the psyches of the women, and specifically how their experiences brought them to the ring, and also how the experience in the ring will inform the rest of their lives as well. But because the author is so interested in those things, we don't get a really good sense for the emotional character. The type of person that I think this could work really well for is the type of person who likes more plot-driven stories, wants to know what's going to happen next. Other people who will enjoy this are the types that like really tight writing that expresses ideas instead of emotions. The Slob by Erin Beauregard. It is taking every fiber of my being not to spoil what happens in the book, because what happens in the book is insanely egregious, but lucky for you, it would get me kicked off YouTube if I were to talk about it. The Slob is about a woman who's in this perfect marriage with a perfect guy who fully supports her after she's had a really tumultuous childhood, including the loss of a sibling. In the present, and I believe this takes place in the 70s or 80s, maybe early 90s. I can't remember. But this woman needs to make a little extra money, so she decides to start selling vacuums. And in doing so, she's traveling around all the neighborhoods in the area and demonstrating how great the vacuums are. It might even be carpet cleaners. Details. You know where this is going. She goes into the wrong person's home, and he definitely kidnaps her. This book contains some of the most disturbing treatment of any human that I've ever read. And I think what's important to note isn't that this was just extreme body horror, but it was very specific to the female experience, which is why I didn't like this. It feels exploitative of this character being a woman, which I think is ridiculous. There are probably people who love this book. I am not one of those people, and I'm gonna take some pride in that. Something Will Happen You'll See by, oh my god, Christos Economou. This has been translated from the Greek by Karen Emmerich. This is a set of short stories that I decided to read because at the time I was doing an around the world challenge for myself, and this was the pick for Greece. I eventually gave up on that challenge because frankly I don't want to read a bunch of straight lit, and it's really hard to find translated queer works from all over the world. It's becoming easier, and I love that, but it's still not at a place where I want to do an around the world challenge. And if I'm being honest, I don't fully remember any of the stories in here. I have a very visual memory, and I can kind of remember some of the stuff that happens, but ultimately these stories take place during the Great Recession, kind of at the end of the 2000s, early 2010s, when Greece is doing terribly, and things are genuinely scary for that country. I did not find this very interesting at all, so I have no idea what else to say. It's just not interesting. Orbital by Samantha Harvey. I've talked a lot about this book on this channel, which feels so weird because I can't wait to not talk about this anymore. So this is 207 pages long. Tiny bunny. Tiny bunny. I have no idea where I came up with that. Why? It won the Booker Prize, and this is honestly no plot, just vibes. We're stepping into the perspectives of astronauts in a like international space station that's orbiting Earth, hence the title. And kind of similar to Headshot by Rita Bullwinkle, we're getting to know a little bit about the astronauts as they are, the astronauts as they were, and I think there might even be a little bit of like future telling in there. I honestly can't remember. And that's the thing. I just couldn't remember this because again, Again. I like my character-driven stories, and this one is just too intentionally superficial. It is simply, again, just one that I don't really like. I want more time with my characters. I want more time with their inner emotional worlds. If you are someone who likes space and you like literary fiction, but you want something that's a bit faster paced, even though there's not really a plot, this might check some boxes for you. Secret Santa by Andrew Schaefer. This is satirical holiday horror. It's about Lucy Meyer, who is hired as an editor at a prestigious publishing firm, and she's basically tasked with reviving this publishing firm, finding the next big star. An important thing to understand about Lucy is that she interviewed for the job with the owner of the company, who is a terrible person, and eventually dies the next day. And no one knew if he had any intention of giving her the job or not, even though she was fairly convinced it was a bad interview. So she convinces the new owner, which is the guy's son, that she had been given the job. And that's how she ends up here. This has culty vibes, this has cursed item vibes, this is about a Secret Santa gift exchange, and the book has a lot of throwback energy to 1980s horror. Lots of talk of Stephen King in here, and also horror tropes that are happening in the 80s. But ultimately, this was just one book where I was just a little underwhelmed. The Troop by Nick Cutter. Read this for the It's Only a Book Club on Fable. It's horror with some body horror elements, and it's sort of a retelling of Lord of the Flies. So this is about a scoutmaster who takes 5 boys to an island, a remote island off the Canadian coast, and does kind of a, survival trip, right? But on that trip, they encounter a sinister virus, or parasite. I guess it's a parasite. Whatever it is, it's contagious. I think the author is trying to make some commentary on masculinity here, as we kind of watch these teenage boys have to muster up some bravery and also deal with power dynamics. We get a lot of internal dialogue, and it always just kind of seems like they want to be closer to each other and even understand each other more. So you're thinking oh, okay, that sounds interesting. And it does, but it ends up just being punished by the author. I would be fine with that punishment if it said something on a larger scale, maybe even a moral lesson being learned here, but unfortunately that just doesn't happen. Bookshops and Bone Dust by Travis Baldree. This is actually my highest rated, worst book. This is the sequel to Legends and Lattes, which is considered kind of the pinnacle of cozy fantasy. A couple things happened for me between reading Legends and Lattes and finishing Bookshops and Bone Dust. One of them is sort of nothing really the author can do to change anything. And that's that the cozy fantasy genre or trope or structure implies that there's not a lot of high stakes. In fact, on the first book, it says low stakes, high fantasy. The problem with low stakes is that if you do not introduce a compelling conflict, it's really hard to want to stick with it. Note, low stakes, not no stakes. In this book, it seems like the stakes might be a little too high, especially when a suspicious visitor ends up visiting this town that Viv is in, and I'll get to that in a second. But the point is that I think Baldree is a great writer. I thought Legends and Lattes was absolutely fantastic. However, I think that they're really, really constrained by this low stakes sort of rule to have a fantasy be cozy, and what ends up happening is you get a really stifled story. And part of me almost wishes they had just done away with cozy fantasy and just gone full throttle. Before I get to my second point, I am going to touch on the plot. In the first book, Viv is an orc, and she is retiring from being a headhunter. There ends up being a little bit of a sapphic romance as she decides to open up a coffee shop in this fantastical town that has never even tried coffee before. Everything about a coffee shop is new and novel to this entire community, as is Viv herself. And as you know, it takes a while for the community to fully warm up to not only Viv, but to her coffee shop. And I'd argue it's pretty frickin' wholesome. The second book is actually a prequel. So Viv is young, they're fairly new in this headhunting business, and they get injured on the battlefield and literally have to take off time to recover, and they do so in this sleepy seaside town called Merk, which is what I mentioned. Eventually, a mysterious drifter person, I almost said human, they are not human, they are a fantastical creature. They end up coming to this town and they kind of bring with them some bad juju, we'll say. Most of the book is spent watching Viv learn how to become a reader, while she also helps renovate this sort of rundown, kind of unsuccessful bookshop. It's often just a lot of tedium. The second thing that I was talking about that's happened between reading Legends and Lattes and finishing Bookshops and Bone Dust was my seeing a TikTok creator who I really, really respect. Their name is Mary? God, I wish I could remember their handle. You know what? Doesn't matter. It's probably gonna be banned anyway. And they had talked about how cozy fantasy has kind of been co-opted by watch me do capitalism, and that just destroyed any type of future enjoyment that I was gonna get from anything that is literally watch me do capitalism. So Although I still love Legends and Lattes, I did not get the same enjoyment out of this. And again, I thought it was a lot of tedium. I was not interested. And by the time we get to the actual conflict and the rising action, we've spent so much time doing really boring stuff that I couldn't even really keep track of what was going on with the main conflict. So anyway, not a fan. Goddess of Filth by V. Castro. We also read this for the It's Only a Book Club and I really hated this. I kind of despised this. The book starts out really promising. The writing feels fresh and different, and then you slowly realize that this has not been edited. For instance, you can read entire paragraphs in here where each sentence is a different topic and a different theme. Feels like someone with ADHD is just rambling. And unfortunately, when that someone with ADHD is a teenager and you yourself are in your late 30s, that becomes painful. This is supposed to be a coming-of-age horror book about a young woman who is possessed, and this takes place in Texas. This introduces themes about the Catholic Church, which I had no idea was going to be like a thing. I like read the back and there's nothing here, that says that the Catholic Church is going to be a theme here. I'm fine with religious themes. It was just felt like it came out of left field. And I think that's part of the problem with the book, is that it's not an exercise in organized thought, and it's not an exercise in organized editing either. And it truly failed. I would say this was my biggest disappointment. Kill Anything That Moves, The American War in Vietnam? The Real American War in Vietnam. This is by Nick Terse, but this is a nonfiction historical account of the US committing atrocities during the Vietnam War against both North and South Vietnamese. And it's truly terrible. In the book, the author is trying to illustrate that the knowledge of these atrocities went all the way to the top. And he actually does that fairly successfully. But I think what's missing in this book, especially as nonfiction, is a deeper analysis of the impact of that. Like, how does that fit into history? Like US history or world history? Does it inform actions in the future? Is it informed by actions in the past? And I don't mean addressing it in just a passage. I'm talking about a literal analysis woven into the narrative of this book. That doesn't happen. Although the author does address how these atrocities affected human rights and also how it has a really huge impact on generational trauma, it feels like it's just checking the boxes of memorializing these accounts. And that's really important. But when I'm reading an entire book of these kinds of atrocities, I really want to understand the bigger picture, and I really want to understand how far-reaching the consequences are when the most powerful country in the world is a bloody tyrant. And last but not least, I did read an HP book that's written by a TERF. I reread it. I try to reread one each month. I'm not going to give it a lot of airtime on here. It doesn't need it, but I reread the second book in that series by the TERF, and it's just it's terrible. I thought it was terrible the first time I read it. This is my, I think maybe third time reading it. It's still bad. It's not a great book. And those are the worst books that I read in 2024. Here is a quick rundown of all the books that I DNF'd in 2024. First up, I DNF'd The Hour of the Witch by Chris Bojalian. Honestly, I thought the writing was a bit dry, and I'm not really that into witches, so it had a lot going against it anyway. If you're into witches, do not pay attention to me. This may be for you. The Four Winds by Kristen Hanna. I really gave this the college try, and I was bored to tears. I had no interest in the world building. I was really bored by kind of the characterization of the world building, and I mean that literally. It was almost a personification of the world building. And although I love great setting, I'm not frequently into setting being a main character, and that's what I felt like this was for the first however many pages I got through. So I'm probably not going to be reading Kristen Hanna again. I know this is one of her more beloved books, and I'm not into it, which is a bummer because I love historical fiction. You Dreamed of Empires by Alvarez Enrique. This also felt dry to me. There's a bit of a theme going on here, and I think that may have suffered from me just not being in the mood for something like this, which it felt very much in the vein of magical realism. However, it didn't feel magical, is the thing. Then The Bear and the Nightingale. I talked about this in my wrap-up, and it moved slow. I wasn't interested in the characters. I was genuinely surprised that I was almost 100 pages in and just meeting one of the main characters that, according to the blurb, is a catalyst for things. That was like red alert going off that I should be DNFing this. That, and this takes place in Russia. I just was reading this and I was like, there's no queerness in this, and I just really don't want to be reading something right now where, you know, it's a fantasy fucking world and there are no queers. Like, Come on. Tentacle by Rita Indiana. So this is dystopian sci-fi taking place in Dominican Republic about a maid who is prophesied to save the world. And part of the process of saving the world involves her transitioning into a man. This is, and the reason I point that out is because this is supposed to be queer commentary, especially on Dominican Republic dynamics. This is not by any means an American book, so there's something lost in translation there. I found this to be somewhat juvenile, and I do think the author was pretty young when they wrote this, so like props to them. And I think the author is a really, really interesting person. They teach, I think, at NYU. Like they seem really, really cool. I want to keep an eye on them, but I did not like this, and I DNF'd this really quickly. The Vaster Wilds by Lauren Groff. I listened to the audiobook. I also had the physical book with me. I actually got rid of the physical book because I 1000% DNF'd this. I really did not jive with the writing style. It was very, very purple. I like was hearing it and I was like, this sounds biblical. And I opened the book and I'm like, this is Bible. And sure enough, I go online later and I look at reviews, published reviews, and they're actually talking about how biblical Lauren Groff's writings are. And I'm like, oh, okay, I'm probably not gonna like reading this person. So I gave that book to a friend that I know would really like it. Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo. Y'all, I was so bummed. So here's the thing. I really liked the writing in this. I was really impressed. I only got, I think, maybe 50 pages in before I gave up. And one of the big reasons I gave up was because I had no idea what anything was. I later found out that for a lot of people it makes more sense to read the other books in the Grishaverse, I think is what it's called. I guess the core of that would be the YA trilogy, and I have no desire to read YA fantasy. I'm not saying it's bad. Like, there was a time when I was super into it. I'm not into it now. And I was like, wait, I have to read 3 more books to just understand the terminology in this. And that's typically why I don't read fantasy, because there's a lot of terminology that you have to pick up and remember. And I am not great at that in real life. So to ask me to do that on my leisure time that is not happening. I was bummed because I think I would have really liked this if I could have understood it. The Books of Jacob by Olga Tokarczuk. On paper, this is like my jam. It's a big ass book that tells a multi-generational story, has a little bit of like a magical realism element to it, but is still fairly grounded in this mid-18th century Europe, which love. And yet I could not get into this. It really moved at a snail's pace. I felt like there was a lot of extraneous detail in this that I was not into. I will credit this book with helping me realize that I need to DNF more. And this book has led me to a point where I can now more easily DNF with way less shame, but I still am bummed that I love big books. So I was so sad to know that a big book wasn't gonna work for me. The Christmas Orphans Club. I DNF'd this in December very, very recently. I really hated this. There was a quote in here that it starts off the very first chapter, like after the prologue. It's something along the lines of like, I, Hannah Gallagher, am somewhat of an expert on depressing playlists. I'm not here for your millennial core nonsense. I'm so glad that I did not continue on with this. And speaking of things that I DNF'd during Christmas that were queer, Nightmare Before Christmas. But I think what typically goes wrong in a lot of rom-coms is there's an emphasis on this sort of poppy, zippy, energetic writing instead of creating really compelling characters, and that's exactly what happens in here. I also had heard from multiple gay men that this was sort of a gay romance for straight women, written by a straight woman. And there's something about that sentiment that just made me want to put it down. I also DNF'd Whale Fall by Daniel Kraus. I read this after reading Drowning by TJ Newman, which I was super obsessed with. I've talked about it quite a bit. And I was like, oh my god, maybe I love underwater stuff. And no, I do not love underwater stuff. This wasn't written poorly, but it was so dry and sciencey. I was not into this. It's about a man who goes deep sea diving. He is swallowed by a sperm whale and has like an hour to live in this animal's stomach. So it sounds really cool and weird, and it sounds up my alley, basically. However, it was actually pretty boring, and I DNF'd it really quick. And last but not least, I finally gave up after trying over and over and over and over and over again on reading the Lord of the Rings trilogy. I am not interested in this at all. I have tried so many times, and I just think it is so boring. It's just boring. Do I think it's poorly written? No. Do I respect it for how it has influenced literature and fantasy for literally decades? Absolutely. Do I have a good time reading it? No, not at all. I will watch the movies until the day I die. I would take them with me on an abandoned island with nothing else. The books? I'm gonna get rid of them. And that was Worst Books and DNF'd Books of 2024. Thank you so much for hanging around. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so we can keep the discussion about books going. And as always, have a wonderful day and happy reading.